Don't do this. What are you doing? Oh my God! What are you doing?
Put your hands behind your back like you're told. Put your hands.
What are you doing? Oh, Jesus. Oh my God. Oh, please.
Put your
I wasn't
hands.
doing anything. Oh my God. Jesus.
In the summer heat of Valdosta, Georgia, a single decision shattered the line between law enforcement and lawful misconduct. What was meant to be a standard response to a call at a Walgreens suddenly exploded into physical violence. Violence against the wrong man. A camera caught it all. And though the body shook, it was the footage that remained steady, capturing in brutal clarity what happens when assumption replaces investigation and identity becomes the blunt instrument of profiling. The body cam begins without ceremony. A man walking down the street, unarmed, unaggressive, calm. His pace is relaxed. And Antonio Arnelo Smith is just trying to get home. He's on the tail end of a mundane errand, having picked up money Western Union to him by his sister. But within seconds, street and sidewalk become the front lines of one of the clearest misuses of authority ever captured on city-issued cameras. Something happens that splits the encounter into a legal before and after. An officer grabs Smith from behind. No warning, no verbal command that establishes a lawful reason for detainment. "Put your hands behind your back," comes the voice, urgently and without cause. The body cam shakes. Smith collapses, crashing to the ground. You can hear the bone go. The cries aren't just loud. They're real. And in a world full of manufactured outrage, it's the sounds here, pain, confusion, disbelief, that make clear this is not resistance, it's not conflict. It's a man being shattered by a system trained to see noncompliance even where none exists. Let's break it down legally. The officers were responding to a report of panhandling. Separate from that, they were also searching for a man with an outstanding warrant. Two entirely unrelated events, according to the transcript and the radio traffic. Smith's appearance somewhat matched, though this is never clear. But here's the mistake that defines everything. They grabbed the first black man someone pointed out without confirmation, caution, or legal basis. Smith had already interacted with one officer moments before. He voluntarily identified himself, something not legally required under Georgia law unless certain conditions are met. But Smith cooperated anyway. He explained his Western Union errand. He invited the officer to call his sister to verify his story. Now pause. At this moment, everything is lawful. A consensual interaction with no suspicion of a crime. The responding officer could have investigated the warrant further, verified Smith's story, moved on. Instead, a second officer, Billy Wheeler, enters the scene cold. He doesn't speak to Smith. He doesn't debrief his colleague. He rushes past procedure and straight into physical custody. And yet even after the force is applied, even after the man is crying out in pain, the investigation doesn't begin. The 14th Amendment chain guarantees equal protection under the law. For Smith, a black man, that guarantee wasn't delayed. It was denied entirely. The officer saw color, presence, and location, and leapt to action without probable cause. Legally, probable cause must be backed by articulable facts, not a vague description, hearsay from Walgreens employees, or someone pointing from across the street. At Utah, the officers begin to realize what others already know. They got the wrong man. The emotional turn in the video is slight but unmistakable. Until now, the officers moved with conviction. But after detainment, after injury, the tone changes. "That's the other guy," someone says over the radio, referring to the real suspect. They pointed out two different people. This isn't just confusion, it's confirmation. They tackled and injured a man based not on evidence, but on the most fragile indicator of all, assumption. In law, there's a difference between mistake and negligence. Mistakes may be forgivable. Negligence, particularly when backed by power, is not. When Officer Wheeler acted, he didn't follow department policy. He didn't ensure that Smith met the description. He didn't assess danger, threat posture, or behavior. He simply grabbed him. Use of force policy varies between departments, but one rule is consistent across states: objective reasonableness. From Graham versus Connor to Tennessee versus Garner, the courts have spoken clearly. The use of force must be proportional to the situation and must be necessary. Here, it was neither. Smith was cooperating. He had offered his ID. He had explained his presence, gave names, offered verification. There was no resisting, no fleeing, no signs of threat. The standard of immediate necessity of force was never met. And yet, once slammed to the pavement, Smith lay broken. His wrist shattered, shoulder dislocated, jaw tight with pain. He gasped, "You broke my wrist." The officer said nothing, and the legal violations began to stack quickly. Georgia law. OCGA, paragraph 16.523.1, defines battery as intentionally causing substantial physical or visible bodily harm. Smith's wrist didn't just hurt, it was clearly fractured. This is not incidental contact, it's injury by deployment of physical force against a non-threatening civilian. Wheeler made no recorded attempt to de-escalate. There was no internal threat assessment. The encounter went straight to violence. Further statutes come into play. OCGA, Reductor 16-10-24, which addresses a public officer's failure to uphold their obligation. It demands that officers act honorably and within the authority of their position. When those actions step outside the legal bounds, like slamming someone without warning or basis, they are no longer protected by qualified immunity. The law does not shield disregard. Back on the ground, Smith continues to plead, "En extect fjouwer." Officers begin to look worried. Officer Wheeler, now realizing the severity of the injury, removes the handcuffs. There's a pause. A moment where silence says more than dialogue ever could. That's the sound of realization and, potentially, regret. Yet accountability still evades them all. No officer offers an apology. No supervisor is called to advise or mediate. Instead, the effort shifts not to repair, but to control. Radio calls update the mistake. Reports are made. The tone becomes logistical. Meanwhile, Smith lies on the concrete, hurt, humiliated, unheard. This neglect is institutional, not just individual. When officers are deployed to a scene, they are trained to take control. But what happens when control becomes the objective? Not justice, not assessment, not protection, but dominance. This incident is a direct result of a department culture that allows instinct to override investigation. To their credit, some deputies begin to process what's occurred. They recognize Smith isn't the suspect. They relay the information clearly. But even then, it's reactionary, remedial. They comfort only after the damage is done, not to the man, but to their sense of authority. Smith, for his part, shows unimaginable poise. He doesn't scream for retribution. He asks to go home. He declines medical care. Whether it's trauma response, dignity, or simple exhaustion, Smith becomes the most emotionally balanced person in the entire encounter. despite being the only one victimized. At this stage, it's clear. No law granted officers the authority to act as they did. No internal guideline authorized body slamming a cooperating civilian mistaken for someone else. And yet, the structure of modern policing, urgency over caution, instinct over de-escalation, made this not an anomaly but an eventuality. As Part 1 closes, the damage is physical and systemic. A man walks away injured. Officers walk away unchanged. And a city, for the moment, watches quietly until the footage spreads, until accountability is demanded. In Part 2, we walk into the aftermath, not just of a slammed wrist, but of a city's legal reckoning. As lawsuits emerge, internal damage control begins, and citizens begin asking the question law enforcement could not answer that day. What if this wasn't on camera? In incidents like this, the reckoning rarely arrives on the sidewalk, where the harm first occurs. It surfaces days, weeks, or even months later, in the murky bureaucratic aftermath, where institutions scramble to reframe accountability as public relations. For Antonio Arnelo Smith, however, that reckoning began the moment his bones fractured on Georgia pavement, and it came documented in full, irreversible clarity. Now, with the unmistakable evidence captured on Bodycam, both the officers involved and their department would be forced to confront a truth they failed to acknowledge in real time. They hurt an innocent man entirely without cause, and now the weight of the Constitution was coming to their doorstep. We pick up mid-scene as the confusion begins to unfold among officers on the ground. At Ekchat, the tone shifts from assertive control to muted realization. Someone quietly acknowledges over radio that the other guy is over there. In this context, the other guy refers to the man who actually had a warrant, the man who wasn't tackled. That admission, while perhaps procedural, lands like thunder. It confirms what the rest of the footage has already made horrifically obvious. They have the wrong man. From this moment forward, every action shifts from mistaken detainment to official damage control. One officer starts checking Smith's ID. Another awkwardly asks Smith if he'd like the ambulance to look him over. Smith, stunned and in pain, declines, clearly unsure whether he can trust any further involvement with those who've just physically harmed him. Officer Wheeler adjusts Smith's body, tries softly to help him lean, and speaks in the kind of hushed, regretful tones that emerge only after someone's actions have become indefensible. But there are some things you don't walk back. No tone can unbreak a wrist. No body cam can capture a first-hand apology, because none was offered. Instead, around A8 and inter-officer dialogue becomes more defensive than investigative. Wheeler begins scanning faces, hoping to shift the blame. He says, in essence, "I thought he was the guy you pointed at." The other officer returns volley. "They pointed this guy out too." A third officer updates dispatch, just running his 1029 to verify. The framing suggests an attempt to clean up the error by over-documenting post-impact behavior. But what's critically missing during this entire phase is any clear verbal recognition of wrongdoing. Statements like, "We messed up. We need to document this injury," or "Let's call a supervisor and notify internal affairs," are never heard. In a constitutional context, this omission is deafening, because an acknowledgement of harm is not the same as an admission of guilt, but law enforcement often treats them as one and the same. In the absence of confession, harm gets buried under paper. By Chaiten Theo, Officer Wheeler, who committed the takedown, begins moving differently, hands on hips. His body's less composed. He knows what's happened. But like far too many in his position, he doesn't say so on the record, and internally the others are scrambling too. One officer rambles about who pointed at who from the store. Others suggest blame lies with community witnesses who insisted that guy was the suspect. It's an attempt to outsource responsibility to the crowd. But in modern law enforcement, training isn't designed to reflect the assumptions of bystanders. It's supposed to surpass them. That's the job, that's the badge. What we begin to witness now is procedural justification masquerading as accountability. All officers on scene are visibly aware the arrest was wrongful. Yet instead of pausing and respecting the significance of what just unfolded, they press forward on technicalities, running IDs, writing names, managing the scene as though the act had been logical and proportional from the start. The internal excuse is compound. Officers appear confused, not just about identifiers, but about agency. He said he's the one we were calling about, one deputy mutters. Another contradicts. No, it's the other guy. This chaotic, unsynchronized communication might be chalked up to field confusion in a high-stress environment, but viewed through the legal lens of the failure to confirm suspect identity before use of force, it becomes far more revealing, because pre-contact verification isn't just good practice, it's required. Under Chanteri v. Greece, Ohio, before any force or even directions to detain, an officer must have reasonable, articulable suspicion that a person is or is about to be engaged in criminal activity. Here that bar was conclusively not met. Officers acted not on facts, not even on misunderstanding, but on impulse. And after the fact, instead of reassessing, they recontextualized. Step by step, this becomes a case study in how procedural failure snowballs inside the system. First, assumption. Smith looks like a subject. Second, action. They detain him without vetting. Third, injury, a harm legally actionable takes place. Fourth, realization. The target was innocent. Fifth, rationalization. Officers aim to backfill justifications. And finally, sixth, deflection. Blame shifts toward confusion or the crowd, or simply evaporates. This chain isn't unique to Valdosta. It's endemic to departments across the country, where use of force training remains defensive and reactive rather than constitutionally proactive. And every time it occurs, lawsuits follow. And so they did. Initially, Smith didn't want to press charges. His wrist was broken, his dignity violated. Still, he declined medical attention and simply asked to go home. But justice organized itself outside those parking lot lines, because once the footage went public outrage surged. The Bodycam clips gained traction online. Instaclips, media breakdowns. Civil rights organizations circulated the takedown as a fresh example of George Floyd-era policing failures, the irrational use of force, and the racial defaulting that continues to define too many Black American confrontations with law enforcement. At the heart of this case was a legal turn with national resonance. Title 42, Section 1983, one of the most powerful federal statutes enabled for civil rights litigation. Filed by Smith's attorney, the resulting federal suit alleged violations of constitutional rights under the Fourth and 14th Amendments, excessive use of force without legal basis, lack of due process and equal protection under the law, assault and battery under Georgia tort law, negligence and failure to train under municipal liability standards. In short, the suit threw daylight into every dark corner of that day's events. By the time court submissions were underway, a figure emerged in public filings. 700,000 sought in damages. The city, its legal team bracing for deeper institutional review, eventually reached settlement. $350,000 paid out to Smith and the creation of a citizen review board, DIL, local reform designed to add structural oversight to future use of force incidents. But that payment, that board, is not the end of this story. It's just a fiscal coda on a larger reckoning. Because here's the most difficult truth bodycams reveal. Accountability, when it does arrive, is bureaucratic and belated. Smith got justice, eventually, but only after public exposure pressured the very institutions that initially wanted to minimize, deny, or bury the event. It leaves one final chilling reminder. If there were no camera, no footage from that officer's chest, that prevailing narrative wouldn't have been Smith's cries. It would have likely been a resisted arrest report. And no lawsuit, no payout, no review board. We'll also examine the role of race in this fractured system. Because despite every legal argument made since, the fact remains. Antonio Smith was tackled because he fit a description, not the one from the call, but the one still embedded in the DNA of institutional profiling. The final chapter of this story doesn't unfold on the pavement of that Valdosta parking lot. It unfolds in the deep recesses of systemic behavior, inside the unwritten codes that guide police response, the cultural reflexes that influence who gets questioned and who gets tackled. Because what happened to Antonio Arnelo Smith wasn't just a moment. It was a moment sitting atop layers of pattern. And to understand how it happened, to prevent it from happening again, we need to look beyond the mistake and into the mechanisms that made it inevitable. Let's begin with race, not as a footnote, but as a root. Antonio Smith was a 46-year-old black man walking alone in a community where law enforcement was responding to a report of panhandling. Another man was allegedly wanted on a parole violation, also black. 2 reports, separate facts. But in that heat, amid the rush to assert presence, those facts collapsed into one assumption. A black man near a crime scene must be the suspect. No weapons, no resistance, no matching ID. But all it took was he's over there, and suddenly Smith became a warrant in motion. What we see in Smith's takedown isn't a failure of law. It's a failure of conditioning, a deeply embedded mindset that presumes guilt under the camouflage of skin tone and proximity. Officer Billy Wheeler didn't stop to verify. He saw a black man being addressed by another officer and made a decision. Not analytical, instinctual. This is racial profiling at its most operational. It's not spoken, it doesn't need to be. It exists in the micro instincts trained and reinforced across poorly supervised agencies. Assume first, justify later. For cities like Valdosta, this creates deep fault lines, and incidents like Smith's don't close the cracks, they expose them. When Smith finally walks away from the encounter, his wrist fractured, his dignity bruised. He declines to be taken by ambulance. That choice, quiet as it may seem, speaks volumes. It illustrates a core truth about civilian-police relations in marginalized communities. The trauma doesn't start with the first hit. It starts with the realization that your pain won't be fully heard, no matter how loud it gets. Despite being eligible for medical attention, legal representation, and redress, Smith's first instinct is to leave, to disappear from the scene he never asked to be part of, to get the distance many feel is their only form of justice: removal. Now step back and examine the department's collective behavior. Not one officer in that moment tried to connect human to human with Smith in any meaningful way. No apology, no expression of remorse, no assurance that internal review or proper documentation would take place. It was triage, not for Smith, but for protocol. Let's wrap this up quickly. Get the guy facts, get his ID, let him walk. This isn't resolution, this is containment. But the camera captured more than actions. It captured what police don't want to do when they know they've gone too far. No sergeant arrived on scene. No internal affairs call was triggered immediately. No external medical examiner tagged the incident for injury review. These absences are damning, not because they're explosive, but because they're ordinary. Standard procedure in many precincts begins and ends with surface-level resolution. If the subject is released, declined charges, and walked away, it's as if the harm never occurred at all. Internal files may label it a use of force with no further action. A page, a checkbox, not an acknowledgement. And yet alongside the footage, another narrative was surfacing: national outrage. Think of the timeline. The incident occurred within the same year as George Floyd's killing. At a time when America was already staring into the mirror and asking whether policing, as it stood, still served all communities equally, Smith's case became part of that reckoning. Not as a headline-grabbing tragedy, but as a stark illustration of how small departments, acting under pressure, can quietly commit life-altering violations with no visible pushback. It was only due to public exposure of the Bodycam footage that Smith's case gained the traction required to push it into the civil court system. And when it got there, the facts spoke louder than any argument. Smith's wrist was broken. He had offered identification voluntarily. No resisting arrest occurred. No warning was issued before force was applied. The suspect officers were seeking was not him. He was tackled seconds after one officer began a conversation that had not become investigatory. When viewed through the legal matrix, the standards set by Terry v's Ohio, Graham v. Connor, and the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable seizures, Smith's treatment failed every constitutional test. His rights weren't incidentally infringed. They were smashed open in full view of government-grade surveillance. Which brings us to qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that often shields officers from accountability unless they violate clearly established law. The irony here is brutal. Clear violations did occur. But had the camera not been rolling, would they have been believed? Even today, legal scholars point to Smith's case in training materials as an example of where qualified immunity should not apply. The force was disproportionate. The identity was wrong. The detention was baseless. In short, it was a textbook failure of constitutional policing. This is what led to the eventual settlement. $350,000 paid to Smith in exchange for dropping all further claims. A citizen review board was also created, theoretically to increase civic oversight on future complaints. But what that board represents is telling. Because when a department settles a case and offers oversight only after exposure, it reveals what many civil rights attorneys argue defines policing today. Reform is reactive, not proactive. reactive to lawsuits, reactive to PR fallout, reactive to external pressure, and in cities like Valdosta, where national eyes don't regularly watch, the precedent becomes far more dangerous. If not for a body cam, Smith would have been a suspected suspect who walked off hurt with no clarity of cause. Now, years later, Smith's case has become more than a payout. It's a case study, quietly embedded in training seminars, legal briefings, policy reform workshops, and his voice, though absent from post-incident interviews, still echoes through every frame of that footage, especially when he asks, "What are you doing?" That question wasn't rhetorical, it was systemic, and it hasn't yet been answered. But this case leaves us with more than tragedy. It leaves a playbook. Always confirm, identify before engagement. Never presume authority where presence of facts is still unclear. Use of force policy must account not for how excited officers feel, but how jure objectively necessary the force actually is. Internal review must be initiated by officers, not by lawsuits. Bodycam deployment must lead to real disciplinary action, not just public distraction. And most importantly, equal protection under law cannot depend on complexion, because that is what this all comes down to. Smith was tackled, not because he resisted or posed a threat or fled, but because someone who looked like him was wanted. And in a split second, that skin match became guilt in the eyes of a police department trained not to ask questions before asserting power. This wasn't just a cracked wrist, it was a cracked mirror, a reflection of what happens when law enforcement loses sight of the humanity behind the uniform and begins to see the public as suspects until proven otherwise. We end where the video ends. Smith refusing EMT care, clutching his broken arm, and quietly walking away from the scene of his own injustice. There were no sirens for him, no formal apologies. He didn't live stream his pain, didn't shout for a crowd. He just stood up and walked home with a story the system never intended to hear. But the camera heard it. The footage carried it. And now, the world sees it.